introduce Lisa Soul Cahill, who has a PhD from the University of Chicago and is the Monin Professor of Theology at Boston College. She is past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the Society of Christian Ethics. Her works include Global Justice, Christology and Christian Ethics, Theological Bioethics, and Sex, Gender, and Christian Ethics. She and her husband are the parents of 5 children. Lisa.
Thank you, Jim. It's very exciting to be here tonight for what I'm sure will be another successful event of this week-long celebration of ecology and Laudato Si in particular. And it's my privilege to introduce 3 people who are very exciting thinkers. I've known all of them for a number of years. I'll start with our moderator, Grant Galicio, who is an associate editor of the oldest independent lay-run Catholic journal of opinion in the United States, namely Commonweal. And he has recently been named as the Director of Publications and Media for the Archdiocese of Chicago, a position that he will begin on November 1st. Grant is also a prolific author himself and a contributor to various Catholic journals and magazines and other media outlets, including, for example, the National Catholic Reporter and the Tablet of London. I think the first one to speak, as they are listed on the program, is Willis Jenkins. Willis is a professor of religion, ethics, and environment at the University of Virginia. He's also the director of graduate studies. He has written very prolifically on the environment, on justice, and especially on climate change. Has many books and edited books and journal issues to his credit. Most notably, he is the author of 2 award-winning books. One from 2008 won the Templeton Award for Theological Promise, and it is called Ecologies of Grace. In 2013, he published The Future of Ethics, Sustainability, Social Justice, and Religious Creativity, and that won the American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence. And just last week, I was privileged to hear a paper that he gave in Rome at a conference on Laudato Si. So he comes to us prepared and full of energetic ideas. And certainly the same is true of Erin Lowe's-Viviano, who has a PhD in systematic theology from Fordham, but also of note, she has a master's in theology from BC. And she researches and teaches in energy ethics and faith-based environmentalism as an assistant professor at the College of St. Elizabeth. She has 2 books from 2007, one called The Paradox of Christian Sacrifice, Loss of Self, Gift of Self, and more recently she has a new book which is appearing next year. It is called Inspired Sustainability, Planting Seeds for Action. One of the things that she's done is to chair a task force with the Catholic Theological Society of America on energy ethics. And that task force produced a very exciting article, I can say from personal experience, last January in the Journal of Catholic Moral Theology. It was authored by a team, and it was one of the most detailed, incisive, and clearly written pieces dealing with U.S. energy policy specifically and politics that I have seen. And so the title of that is Catholic Moral Traditions and Energy Ethics for the 21st Century. And it is available to all of us for free at the website of the Journal of Moral Theology. So thank you for joining us. I will sit down until 6 o'clock when I will get up and make sure that we conclude on time. So Grant, I hope you'll be willing to take over.
Yeah. Well, do you just want to start? Yeah.
I will just start.
Yeah.
That sounds good. Thanks, Lisa, for the introduction, and thank you to Jim Keenan for organizing this event, and thanks, I know that there are many people who have been involved in organizing it. Thank you to all of you. I'm really honored to be able to participate in this. It's quite something to be asked to Boston College, of all places, to talk about an encyclical where there are so many people from whom I should learn. And I'm glad that the setup of the evening will allow me to learn from you. So what I'm going to highlight 4 things from the encyclical that especially focus on its contribution to global environmental thought. So I'm interested in how it situates itself in relationship to, big sustainability debates. And so here's the first one. I think the Pope is saying, don't solve climate change. This is what he says. Rather than a problem to be solved, the world is a joyful mystery to be contemplated with gladness and praise. That's right from the start. And that stance is emphasized throughout the letter. Climate change and other global environmental problems must not become occasions for intensifying human control over nature, and especially not occasions for the wealthy to intensify their capture of resources. Earth is not a set of environmental problems in need of applied solutions. It is, first of all, our common home, shared with one another and with many other creatures. Where humans have caused disturbances in our home, we should regard them not as problems in our environment, but as crises in ourselves. Many things have to change, of course, says Francis, but it is we human beings, above all, who need to change. So Francis is not too keen on carbon markets or geoengineering schemes or things like that, because they seem to keep in place a mindset that reinforces attitudes of instrumentalist control. In his view, I think the greatest peril posed by climate change is not that humanity will fail to respond to it. It is that in the various ways that we do eventually respond to it, we'll reproduce the attitudes and intensify the powers that caused the problem in the first place. That is a hard teaching for people of goodwill in the global north. People like us in this room, I think, because it means that the greatest peril is not that the talks in Paris will fail, or that our Congress will continue to embarrass us, or that the fossil fuel industries will undermine our best solutions. It means we could take comfort in each of those ideas, but it means that the greatest peril is in our own continued acceptance of normal attitudes toward Earth and toward other people that are carried and reproduced by the structures of our everyday life. Francis says I think he's saying we learn how to take responsibility for our problems, we learn how to care for our common Earth only by learning to give up the pretense of control over reality and learn instead to listen to its suffering. Listen to the cry of Mother Earth and the cry of the poor. Which brings me to the second thing I want to highlight. Listen to Mother Earth. If it sounds weird to you to hear the cry of Mother Earth or to try to listen to the songs that other creatures sing to God, as the encyclical has us imagine, that is because of a massive cultural mistake that we have inherited. For 200 years, the time of the fossil fuel empire, we've imagined ourselves as separate from nature and masters of it. Climate change, on Francis's view, is a symptom of what goes wrong when we live by that illusion. We are, in fact, flesh of this earth and kin with its creatures. And when we hold on to the illusion of separation, we inevitably do violence to earth, to our neighbors, and to ourselves. Separating ourselves from earth, we dehumanize ourselves. So if hearing the cry of Mother Earth or listening to other creatures sounds funny to our ears, the encyclical suggests that is because a dominant mindset, what it calls the technocratic paradigm, has suppressed the voice of Mother Earth. This sister now cries out to us, writes Francis, because of our abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. The same mindset that allows us to abuse Earth also closes our ears to the voices of other creatures. Says Francis, "We have come to see ourselves as her Lord and Master, entitled to plunder her at will." So problems, discrete practical problems like water scarcity in the West, or air pollution, or climate change, should be seen as signs of something wrong with how humans understand themselves in relation to the living world around us, a living world that is silent to many of us. Francis is suggesting that the membership of our common home has something to tell us, and something to tell us about ourselves, about how to be human, something to teach us. But in the global north especially, our privilege prevents reality from disturbing us that way. People of wealth and power love to think that there are technical solutions to the problems that we are causing, solutions that will suppress attention to the violence at root of them. One reason for our disinterest in hearing the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth is that as we manage our environments now, they typically inscribe the advantages of the wealthy right into the landscape. It almost seems natural to us that toxic hazards spring up in poor neighborhoods, as if that was the natural habitat of toxins. It comes to seem to us, after the contracts are signed and the pipelines are sunk, that fresh water has always flowed from poor lands to wealthy cities. It is beginning to seem natural to us that storms engulf coastal cities in South Asian seas, but crash up against the reinforcements of North Atlantic cities. So the exclusions and the invulnerabilities of our social world are naturalized by the ways that we respond to and manage environmental problems. And that perversely multiplies the advantages of the wealthy over the disadvantaged through the solutions that we think we have. Integral ecology is the concept that Francis uses to make that connection. Abuse of the earth almost always includes exploitation of the poor. Indifference to the poor tracks with indifference to the earth. It's reflexive. So that, in Francis's view, globalization of consumer culture generates what he called in his previous encyclical a globalization of indifference. That's the ecological consequence of our economic inequality. A plutocratic society loves to tell itself that the best solution for poverty is more freedom for the wealthy, that the best solution for environmental problems is more intervention and more control. Francis, I think, is striking right at the legitimacy of our privileges, and especially the way that that legitimacy moralizes indifference to earth and to the poor. In fact, the phrase the poor, it's mentioned dozens of times in the encyclical at a rate of about once every 5th page. He will not let us forget or sacrifice the poor in a rush to solve global problems. But why? Remembering the poor and their development needs, that seems bad for the environment, right? Okay, so point number 3, human dignity includes the value of non-human creation. Sustainability thought has long had this running debate between anthropocentrism and ecocentrism, between an ethic of human-centeredness or an ethic of nature-centeredness. And that debate, the assumption of that debate has always assumed that a strong priority for human dignity or human freedom threatens the value of environments, and vice versa, that strong ecological protection constrains human development. And Francis kind of evades that dilemma by instead taking this tactic. He ecologically expands what is included in human dignity. Again, don't think about persons as autonomous individuals seeking control of their environments. Think about freedom as freedom to love others, including other creatures. Think about persons as including our ecological flesh, our ecological relations. That's the positive side of the environmental injustice points, right? I mean, if human dignity is vulnerable to assault by the political dispersal of toxins through ecological flows, that just shows that we are ecologically enfleshed creatures and that our dignity is bound up with the integrity of other creatures. That's a point that many indigenous peoples have been making to dominant cultures, which Francis underscores a couple times. Authentic humanity, a phrase he uses, emerges from learning to use the world rightly, which entails this funny paradox. It means, first of all, refusing to regard it as an object to be used. Saint Francis was subversive, writes Pope Francis, because his asceticism was a refusal to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled. By contemplating the goodness of the world, persons find their own dignity by learning to praise the dignity of other creatures. So here's the implication for those global sustainability debates. Francis is saying that the human relation to other creatures shapes our personhood in the deepest possible way. How we relate to other creatures shapes who we become. It matters for our character, which is to say, it matters for our souls, which is to say, the ways we interact with the living world shapes what is most true about us. And in an Anthropocene world, a world where human impact on environments is pervasive and at a planetary scale, what we think about ourselves and what is most true of ourselves has real material effect in planetary systems. So, to the debates about anthropocentrism, here's the Pope's therapeutic paradox. It is in our deepest human interest to see and respect the goodness of non-human creatures. That's our first and highest calling. Last thing I want to highlight here. Everyday practices matter. The encyclical definitely has a vision of a global common good and a somewhat frustrated call for better global governance. But it also refuses to let planetary problems appear as matters for a technocratic elite to take care of, as if our only hope for dealing with climate change is the talks in Paris or in overcoming, denialism in our country. If the root of our problems lies in the sort of persons we are, then there lies also our best hope. Everyday practices matter. And Pope Francis repeatedly refers to the nobility of little daily actions, like using public transportation or planting trees or turning down the lights. He makes a point of recommending the power of simply giving thanks for our meals. And he makes a point of admiring any small way that people prioritize beauty over efficiency or care for others over their own self-advancement. Because those are the little ways that we become different people capable of hearing the songs of the earth and the cries of the excluded. Thanks.
Thanks, Willis. Aaron?
Okay, well, I would also like to thank Jim Keenan for bringing us all here. It's a great pleasure to be here with Grant and Willis, and thank you to Lisa Cahill for her kind introduction, and especially as a graduate of BC, it's a real pleasure to be back. So in addition to learning from those in the room now, I have learned from those in the room before, and I'm delighted to be here as part of this incredible conversation that BC has brought together on this dizzying experience of receiving Laudato Si this fall. And I think that many of us may feel truly breathless. There have been event after event and incredibly important conversations and new sources for us to contemplate on an almost daily basis, it seems. Sure, let me bring that in. So I'm grateful, Willis, for what you've said about inviting us to reflect on the theological meanings of Laudato Si, and the theological vision of freedom, I think, is particularly central. But what I'd like to start with is talking about some of the ethical implications in reference to the work that Professor Cahill mentioned. And what I'd like to suggest is that there's an emerging paradigm of Catholic energy ethics, and I'd like to talk about 4 sources, possibly 5, that go into this. I'd like to very briefly tag them as comprehensive, Laudato Si; radical, the Lima Statement of the Global Bishops before the Lima Conference last December; analytical, as a way to tag a Vatican document called Energy, Justice, and Peace; and then the ethical focus of the paper in the Journal of Moral Theology, Catholic Moral Traditions and Energy Ethics for the 21st Century. So first of all, this document is absolutely comprehensive, but I would like to single out a few paragraphs relating to fossil fuel use, which is the crux of the problem if we look at it in terms of greenhouse gases, if not the crux of the problem if we look at the theological sources of this problem. So paragraph 26 mentions the urgent need to develop policies to limit emissions and substitute for fossil fuels. 165 tells us that fossil fuel technology needs to be replaced progressively without delay. And particularly paragraph 52, it raises the theme of the obligation of superdeveloped nations, and that's a theme I'd like to trace throughout these 4, maybe 5 sources. So paragraph 52 says, the developed countries ought to help pay their ecological debt by significantly limiting their consumption of non-renewable energy and by assisting poorer countries to support policies and programs of sustainable development because they lack the wherewithal to develop the necessary processes and cover their costs. Okay, then the urgent need to adopt these new models at global scale in the immediate time period is beautifully expressed by this second source, a letter signed by many of the global bishops at the Lima Conference to the Parties last December. This is a radical statement. It calls on the world to protect communities already suffering from the impacts of climate change by keeping the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Usually we hear 2 degrees Celsius. The global bishops ask for a move to 100% renewables, and they call for an end to the fossil fuel era. And I don't know which of these statements is more radical or more thrilling and more challenging. How do we achieve this radical but essential plan, a move to 100% renewables, ending the fossil fuel era? What paragraph 52 of Laudato Si states briefly, that there is an obligation of superdeveloped nations, is amplified and spelled out in more detail by this third text, the Energy, Justice, and Peace, a reflection on energy in the current context of development and environmental protection. This was published by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace in 2013. And this text analyzes the relationship of energy to established themes of Catholic social teaching, solidarity, the right to health and development, participation, the option for the poor, and the rights of future generations. So it speaks of a new paradigm of energy ethics regarding both large-scale production and behavioral choices rooted in solidarity. The Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, Bishop Mario Toso, has said, in view of the realization of peace, it is necessary that energy be thought of, produced, distributed, and used according to a new paradigm. And this includes new behavioral patterns based on justice, responsibility, altruism, subsidiarity, and the conception of the integral development of peoples with a view to the common good. So, this text talks about shifting to renewable energy precisely through the obligation of superdeveloped nations. Its most trenchant and specific recommendation is that energy should primarily solve the shortages of the most vulnerable and poorest populations, and only subsequently ensure greater consumption for those who already have plenty of energy. So advanced countries have the moral duty of developing the use of the most complex and capital-intensive new technologies, new, emerging, developing renewable energy technologies, in other words, in order to allow poor countries to feed their development using the simpler and less expensive technologies. And these recommendations are rooted in a call to solidarity and a recognition how energy intersects all forms of globalization, social, economic, technological, political, and moral. We're in a time of moral globalization when all of these decisions have impacts on others, and so are ethical decisions. So the new analysis of energy decisions as a factor in solidarity and integral ecology expresses what some are looking at as a third wave of Catholic social teaching. If the first wave of Catholic social teaching addresses the response to the industrial era and a second wave of Catholic social teaching looks at international development, international justice issues, we're seeing a third wave that is consolidating around the ecological messages. And central to this third wave's ecological and social message is the ethical imperative to act, to make judgments and decisions at all levels of societies. And that ethical imperative is the focus of this fourth source, Catholic Moral Traditions and Energy Ethics for the 21st Century. It's a co-authored paper, and it was reviewed extensively by multiple scientists and policy experts before its peer review. And its aim is to encourage conversation around the theme that energy decisions are ethical decisions. Its method reflects an analysis of current energy realities in the light of principles taken from the U.S. Bishop's 1981 Reflections on the Energy Crisis, which was written in a very different time in the context of peak oil, very different political era. But it nonetheless put forward 6 moral principles that can be applied to energy realities today. Those principles are cherishing and protecting life as a gift from God, accepting an appropriate share of responsibility for the welfare of creation, living in solidarity with others for a common good, namely the sustainability of an abundant earth, striving for justice in society, giving special attention to the needs of the poor and members of minority groups, widespread participation in decision-making processes. And we, the authors, added a 7th principle, which is technological prudence, which has gained enormous new food for thought in Laudato Si, analyzing the need to be very careful about how we view the application of technology and the fundamental philosophical views of technology. So the 3 main sections of this paper consider fossil fuels as energy of the past, natural gas and nuclear energy as energy of the present that are transitional energy forms that should be phased out, and renewable energy is the energy of the future. And regarding this critical question, the obligation of superdeveloped nations to develop the most complex and capital-intensive technologies, our paper concurs that conventional fossil fuels, those that remain within a safe global carbon budget, must be directed toward building a clean energy infrastructure. In other words, use the fossil fuels that remain in our global carbon budget to build the infrastructure for a renewable energy system. And assuming that annual emissions do not change from 2008 and are calculated on a per capita basis globally, which certainly they're used at a much greater rate in the United States, that means the United States' carbon budget would be exhausted in 6 years. So the time for action is now. This requires a revolution in the political and economic valuation of fossil fuels, signs of which we're seeing in various divestment and reinvestment movement, which we are seeing in new developments of microgrids, alternate energy systems globally, as well as the concentrated civic efforts at the UN right now. Pope Francis is accelerating this revolution. So I will briefly mention that his speech to the UN can constitute, in a way, a 5th source because it emphasizes the personal impact of these energy decisions, pointing to the ranks of the victims. That if we do not act, we see the ranks of the victims grow. Victims of power badly exercised, the natural environment, and the vast ranks of the excluded. And thinking of the victims suggests placing ethical responses under the familiar sustainability rubric of adaptation and mitigation. That mitigation requires an energy ethics, purchasing, reinvesting, scaling up renewable energy. And adaptation demands, besides all of the other adaptation measures that sustaining and healing our ecosystems require, it requires hospitality and justice for the climate refugees, one of the most visible signs of the climate disruption that we will see increasingly. And as Pope Francis said in his address to the UN, we cannot rest with lists or theories, but must engage in prudential activity, constantly conscious of the fact that we are dealing with real men and women who live, struggle, and suffer. So the special commitment of advanced nations to combat energy poverty is implied, as access to energy is part of the material means to live in dignity. Prudential activity needs to clearly identify the way that structural sin is incentivized and articulate how each of us have responsibilities within those structural systems. Every American, every citizen of a superdeveloped nation makes energy decisions within his or her sphere of influence, and we are all called upon to assess the meaning of solidarity. As we build this global energy ethics, Laudato Si above all and other sources remind us that genuine human flourishing is not a technical or political question. It's a religious call. It's inviting an ethical transformation and a spiritual response. So it's both a time of war, a time of revolution, but a time of hope. And we're building now on energy as the revolution for the present generation, whose foundations are already present. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. I want to begin by asking Willis to say a little bit more about his opening salvo, which was that the Pope is saying, don't solve climate change. That was provocative. I don't buy it. I think the Pope is saying, isn't the Pope saying work to solve climate change, but don't get tricked into believing that you're the only creatures who are worth doing it for?
Sure, that's a fair qualification. Right, I wouldn't and didn't rest with just the opening provocation, but I think he definitely sees the peril posed by the global north taking charge of how to solve climate change. And I think that peril comes at a number of levels. One is that the global north will find ways to increase its relative advantages over the rest of the world in the kinds of solutions that it proposes. But even more basically than that humanity will suppose its role as a species is to control the earth. And some responses to climate change can become, as he says, an excuse for a series of endless interventions that leave humans sort of even more tyrannically in control than they were before. And I think that's what he wants to set a hedge against. And so when I say the Pope doesn't want us to solve climate change, he means he doesn't want us to solve it in that way.
Yeah.
Right.
There was another question I had, super sexy topic, methodology. So I mentioned this at an earlier panel that I was on like 6 hours ago. So there was a Vatican official who claimed to have worked on the first draft of this encyclical. And he said that the early draft did not lead with climate science. It led with theology. It led with a kind of anthropology in relationship to the Creator. But then at some point, Francis flipped that script. So now he begins with human experience, human knowledge, and then develops ethical imperatives from that knowledge. He talks about the church learning from theology, from philosophy, from science. Why, either one of you can pick this up, but why do you think he made that choice, and what do you think it means for how he approaches theological and ethical questions?
Well, I think for one thing, it begins the conversation on a broader basis, inviting the whole world to participate. As he says, this is a document addressed to every living being on the planet, not only just Catholics, not even people of goodwill.
Right, people of bad will.
People of bad will, maybe especially people of bad will, are invited to listen to what he has to say. So by beginning with the problem and not beginning with the in-house conversation among Catholics, I think he invites that broader conversation. Secondly, it's what's real, right? This is rejecting the the problem of beginning with ideas. He wants to begin with the concrete problem that we're experiencing, and that has precedent in liberation theology and so many approaches.
Agreed. I think that the encyclical is strikingly dialogical throughout. I mean, it calls, yes, for dialogue with every person on the planet, and in multiple places with other religions, with other cultures, with other wisdom traditions, with indigenous peoples, with science. In some places, in general, I myself took heart from that. I thought it was wonderful. It shows that the Pope seems to have a real irenic sense of the possibilities of dialogue at these multiple spheres and even at a global level. I would like to have seen more rationale for his optimism.
Well, that's something that he's been criticized for. That he's been portrayed as a kind of doom and gloom Pope. That he's approached this climate crisis in a very dark way. And reading the document, I mean, the way that he catalogs the terrible facts of the planet, and it's incredibly detailed. I mean, he has everything in there from sponges, the creatures, not what we use to clean, mollusks. He has a riff on urban planning. I mean, it's comprehensive, but he doesn't have a lot of good things to say about those problems. So, which gets to my next one. I mean, you obviously don't write an encyclical if you're a pope as a kind of call to arms if you don't operate from a place of hope. And obviously he's a man who operates from a place of deep hope. But why do you think that's so scarcely evident in the text?
Well, I think for one thing, the point is to challenge us to take action. It's to avoid any sugarcoating of the issue and to say this is a problem that now demands the full attention of his authority as Pope in an entire encyclical because it's a serious problem. So I think that the hope is beautifully brought in the end in the theological sections when he talks about Jesus as the risen Lord holding all creatures to himself and blessing them. There is that beautiful sense of hope, but this document is not written in order to share hope. I think it's written to get people to pay attention and to critically interrogate their behavior, their structures, their false sense of being in absolute control, and where that has led us to the point where as you were saying, increased control is so far from being the solution, it's the cause of the problem. Where we're in the Anthropocene, a time when human control over the environment is making us prisoners of the climate again, as the suffering of climate change is imprisoning us and limiting our life responses and options.
One of the other things that has been criticized about this document is the way it approaches the question of population growth. I mean, it's brought up and then quickly shunted aside. Francis writes, demographic growth is compatible with an integral and shared development. To blame population growth and not an extreme consumerism on the part of some is one way of refusing to face the issues. So, as you probably know, the UN expects the world population to rise from 7 billion, which it is now, to 9 billion by 2040. By 2030, the world is going to need about 50% more food, 45% more energy, and 30% more water. I mean, I get why the Pope of the Holy See, as he was recently called in Congress, doesn't want to say, let's reduce population growth because that could lead to arguments about contraception, which he doesn't want to get mired in. But doesn't the tradition itself have some kind of resource for addressing this question? Since in 1984, John Paul II wrote that the church, quote, fully approves of the natural regulation of family size and responsible parenting. He then referred to, quote, morally correct level that must be established by taking into account not only the good of one's own family and even the state of health and the means of the couples themselves, but also the good of society to which they belong, of the church, and even of all mankind. Do either of you see any way that this might apply to the problem of population growth as it briefly appears in the encyclical?
I agree that the problem is not population growth. The problem is overconsumption of the superdeveloped nations, for whom in most superdeveloped nations, in the United States, a pet consumes 70% of a person in the developing world. So
This is one of the reasons that Pope Francis is against pets, by the way. I don't want to freak you out.
No, I'm sure
but
he's
it's
not.
true.
I'm sure he wants to emphasize the kinship of us with all
It's real.
creation, but the overconsumption of our nations and the throwaway culture is what can't be sustained. And that's why I think it's very wise and perceptive the way he says this is covering up the problem. If all nations consumed and threw away at the rate of the United States, then we would have an impossible model of development. That is what has to change. It's not the size of the population, it's the consumption levels of the population. And that goes for greenhouse gases as well. With 4% of the global population, the United States has produced 24 to 27% of the historical emissions. So it's the rate and proportion that's the problem.
Anything on this, Willis? You don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole.
Well, it's complex and it's difficult to frame well. I mean, I think what Aaron has said is the thing to underscore, that when people and theologians, especially in the global north, begin talking about population, it becomes difficult to have a conversation with integrity, because so much of the problem from a resource perspective is overconsumption, is driven by our lifestyles. So, at what point do we get to legitimately talk about population drivers of the problems that we care about is difficult to say. Now, there may be very good reasons to talk about reproductive freedom, but those reasons probably should begin from somewhere else. There's much more to say about that, but I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the encyclical, the Pope is very clear that there's a kind of ideological tyranny that is involved when reproductive questions are tied to foreign aid.
Yeah.
Well, I won't press this too far. It does seem to me that the question of population growth is serious enough that I think it's only really brought up in 2 paragraphs here. And then even at the large press conference rollout of the encyclical, I mean, even the scientists on the stage have sort of skated past it. But I mean, in countries like China, India, I mean, this is not an issue that I don't think you can just wave it away by saying, well, consumerism. I mean, it does seem that there is a question of family size, and as John Paul put it, there is a kind of moral size of families.
And I think that respect for parents' ability to shape the size of their families and recognition that educating girls and women is one of the best ways for societies to increase their economic stability and at the same time to find a natural reduction in family size is really most consonant with the spirit of spiritual freedom, which includes the right to education, as the Pope has mentioned.
So, Aaron, earlier you mentioned peak oil. We're just getting out of peak Pope season. I've been following him around for the past week, and I was struck in his UN address by a phrase that some people had wondered whether he would utter, and which was, he talked about a true right of the environment. This was something that a lot of theologians had wondered in advance of the release of this encyclical. Was the Pope going to talk about the rights of the planet? And it seems that his answer is yes. I mean, the day after the Pope gave this speech, a few of us were trying to get the Vatican spokesman to say something about this, and he did. We were asking, is this a development of doctrine, or at least a moment when that might begin? And he hemmed and hawed a bit, but and then he seemed to downplay it by saying that the Pope probably wasn't talking about a right of the environment in a technical sense. But the words are there, and it says a true right of the environment. Now, right of the environment is in quotes, and it's not at all clear to me how the Pope intends quotes. Are they a substitute for italics? It's not. Are they scare quotes? I'm not really sure. And he does situate it in such a way that it's kind of derivative from human rights, or one might suggest that. But But isn't that sort of a big deal? I mean, how does that change the conversation about care for the planet, especially given that in the encyclical, he speaks about an intrinsic dignity of the world?
That's a great question, and it's exciting language, especially when you think of a Latin American context where in Bolivia they have a charter of the rights of Mother Earth, a constitutional charter about the rights of the earth. I think that in the view of this encyclical, which emphasizes integral ecology, that is a more dramatic statement of that integral ecology, that the rights of the environment are part of that thicker description of solidarity when humans' kinship with the earth and kinship with the future extends the notion of solidarity between simply ourselves and every other person on the planet. It's all the persons of the future generations, and it's also all the living communities of the earth. So we have this much thicker sense of solidarity, and that includes the rights of the environment. And it's not to tip over into biocentrism as opposed to anthropocentrism. This is a document that is theocentric, and it proceeds from God as creator and the proper relationship of all of us as creatures, whether we're brother, sun, sister, moon, or all of us persons.
So I thought the encyclical left some open ground on this point. For an encyclical that opens so strikingly by invoking Mother Earth from, someone from South America, where there is this very legitimate and robust movement for the rights of nature. It's in the Constitution of Bolivia and Ecuador now, as the rights of nature at a number of levels, and at the highest level, Mother Earth or Pachamama, the indigenous term, which is in the constitutions, both constitutions. That he didn't go for rights of nature or say something about the kinds of political standing that nature needs to have in order, that are correlative to this language of the worth of nature, the goodness of nature, the value of nature. I don't think he has to argue that it would be rights, but I thought if he didn't want to go there, then there ought to have been a paragraph somewhere that would say what kind of governance could allow for that kind of standing. I mean, what rights do in a legal technical sense is simply provide for direct political standing of the thing in question and also direct redress. So that, in American courts, if we're worried about something happening to a forest, we have to, go through this sort of workaround of proving that we have an interest in the forest so that then we can say that we have standing, but when the forest never has the ability to come before the court, even though that's probably what we usually mean. Anyway, I thought when I got to the end of the cyclical and I hadn't seen that, I thought, well, I wonder why it's not there. And then
he went to Bolivia, right? I mean, he actually went to Bolivia, and he got some piece of paper from the lay movements, which asked him to, bring their message to the world. And I wonder whether this was on that list.
It may have been, although it would be weird if he didn't know about it before then.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can't imagine that he didn't include it because it was, too outrageous to the sensibilities of the global north. I mean, it doesn't really seem his style. So anyway, there's more to be learned there. And the fact that then he does introduce it at the UN. Very interesting.
That's an excellent point. It may not be in the encyclical, but it's raised in the international body where that governance might take place.
Right.
So, practical questions. Obviously, there are a lot of young people in this room. Pope Francis is always talking about the young. He has this great phrase about what is it? Is it solidarity with the past? What is the term that he uses? It says he has this way of sort of during several of his talks in Philly and in New York and in Washington, he talked a lot about the recovery of memory, and so he ties this in with he's always talking about taking care of the elderly and making sure not to forget the young. So, and then he had this great line when when the Pope addressed the U.S. bishops in Philly. He said, don't tell young people that everything was better back when. That doesn't get you anywhere. So, it's obvious that young people have taken up the issue of climate change with great vigor. In a way, our parents and grandparents, I'm sort of glomming myself onto young people. I'm not sure if you noticed that. Not 40 yet. But as you know, caring about an issue is not really enough. Liking a Facebook page is not really enough. Creating a Twitter list called environment is not really enough. So in this country, we've seen depressingly low turnout rates among everyone, but especially young people. Do you see young people's energy around the ecological crisis moving them to the ballot box at all?
It's not, I don't know, I mean, I hesitate to offer any cautious political speculation. It's really not my specialty. I think I would describe it differently. I think that for a younger generation, for successive generations from now on, it will simply be taken as a background condition of our life that humanity has a troubled relation with its environment, that we live in conditions of ongoing responsibility for how planetary systems and local systems function. And that's simply an imaginative frame that our parents and grandparents didn't have. Now, how that will work out politically, I don't know, and I think it's an open question. I mean, the worrisome side of that would be that imagination can be overwhelming. It's not clear what you do with that, and then there's there is science that suggests that the more people understand climate change, the less motivated they are to do something directly political about it.
Because it's so scary.
Because it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
I would like to accept your premise and invert it, that this generation and going forward will have, as a background imagination, the consciousness of a troubled relationship with the environment. I would like to invert that to suggest that this generation and those going forward have the consciousness of a caretaker relationship to the environment in a way we have never had before, that young children are educated about recycling, as mundane and small scale as that is, and hopefully increasingly about a consciousness of the way that our structural systems affect our energy, our production, our consumption, and so on. And so I am hopeful that this will be a simply more conscious awareness of our globalization. We're in a world where social media makes us aware of everything that happens globally. That includes the environment. We simply are part of this glut of data, and environmental data is part of it. I'm hopeful that this generation and those going forward see that as part of their care. Yes, there is that real and concerning drain of what is overwhelming, and environmental decision theorists call this a finite pool of worry. There's only so much we can worry about, which I feel is an open invitation for our church, our ethical communities, to insist that we prioritize our most important values so that some of the lesser values can sift away. And within the finite pool of worry that we may yet attend, the environment still has a place. And for that to be socially reinforced is critical, because climate communication theorists also emphasize that we're social, we follow what is the norm, and to have these conversations within the church, within our ethical communities, within our institutions of higher ed, makes this part of the norm, and then that is enormously important for how people take action, whether it's voting, whether it's in new forms of social engagement. Again, I can't say, but I think that we've taken the lid off of some of the places where these actions are concealed, and it's more evident how political structures are causing problems we need to engage with.
And even at the parish level too. I mean, you've seen, here come my questions. How many do we have? Okay, all right, wonderful. All right, let's just switch to your questions. I've had enough time. And we have 8 of them.
But I would just say at the parish level, that's extremely important, because that's where people are dealing with the pragmatic problems that face them, as Willis has written about so often. What are the local problems that someone can actually engage in with the people they know that are part of their community? So the parish work is very important, and we know that the church in this country, through the Climate Covenant and other groups, has done a great deal to foster that.
All right, so question number 1 from the audience. Pope Francis inspires by words and gestures. The divest, reinvest movement seems like a gesture, since we all must use fossil fuels in our daily life. And divestment seems somewhat pointless, as the companies are so big and new investors are happy to purchase these stocks. Is the divestment gesture an important tool to move the dialogue along, as Pope Francis has called us to do?
That's a good question. That's a good question, because I think it's very tactical, and whether divestment makes sense requires a whole host of moral and political judgments that I think are just the kinds of things that we should be thinking about. Let me say that I've been working with the divestment group at the University of Virginia, talking with them for the last couple of years. And the University of Virginia is in such a great spot. We have such a great predicament to talk about divestment because we have our own coal-fired power plant. That is to say, every 3 days, a big train of coal comes right into the center of our university, and that is the only plan we have for energy and heat. So if we were to divest, that would mean that we would be divesting from companies from whom, if they agreed to not deliver their product, we would have actually no other plan for how to run the university. And I think that's a lovely predicament to be in, because it is analogous to what the entire structure of our economy is like right now. On what grounds would we divest from companies that, should they agree right now, tomorrow, to stop delivering their product, we would actually have no plan for how to run our everyday life? I think that makes it tactically different from other kinds of boycott movements. And so it's weird. And I think I'm very wary of divestment as a gesture, as the questioner suggests. I think it can lend itself to a kind of hypocrisy, right? Scapegoating that those companies on which I'm utterly dependent are the problem. And sort of obscuring that it's not my dependency that is the problem. They're just delivering a product that I keep buying. Yet, I think divestment can, if framed the right way, and done in the right way, can be a really powerful tool, as it is already. And so let me just, I'm afraid I could go on about this, but let me just say just this one thing. Other boycott movements and other divestment movements, especially in the apartheid era, came with conditions. Should companies or governments agree to these things, then reinvestment will become morally credible again. I think those conditions have to be part of divestment, because that's how we interpret what a judicious response to climate change looks like. We can't just say we don't like climate change and we resent our dependence on fossil fuels.
I would agree that it may seem like an empty gesture to simply divest, because others may purchase those stocks or commodities or systems. However, there is also the fact that even the symbolic gesture of divesting creates a moral conversation that challenges us to assess the impacts of the fossil fuels. So it raises the question of, are these products harming others, and is there an alternative? And so the really critical reverse side of that is reinvestment, which is not only a valuable symbol, it's an essential practical action, because we need to power our society, our world into the future. We need to power it. Energy is essential for alleviating poverty, and the developing nations are entitled to energy, yet they need renewable energy, and so the only way to get it is to buy it and to reinvest in it. And that requires removing the billions that are placed into fossil fuel subsidies and shifting those into renewable energy. So to reinvest is building the systems of the future that, in fact, already exist. We have the available technologies, and that's been evident since at least 2003 with the Pakala-Sakalo article about the climate wedges, demonstrating that we have the technologies. So what we need, that was to solve the climate problem. But in terms of creating renewable energy, we must invest in them so that we can continue to scale up, to commercialize new technologies, to bring them to scale, to make them cost effective. That's exactly what paragraph 52 of Laudato Si is asking us to do, to invest in the more complex technologies, to bring them to scale, to commercialize them, to reduce their, to make them more cost effective so that they can be spread worldwide. So reinvesting is essential. And I would just say that Bloomberg News reported that this summer, the world has turned the corner and is investing in more renewables than coal, gas, and oil combined. We are now investing in more of those renewables than in fossil fuels.
So, perfect transition from our next questioner. While acknowledging the impact of fossil fuels, it seems that the discussion of carbon in the atmosphere ignores an even greater impact of the factory farming industry. How does this go ignored when it impacts the poor, the environment, and our own bodies?
Well, thank you. It's no longer ignored. That's, I think, right, absolutely. Agriculture, food broadly, is the major part of the human economy, which is to say it's the major part of the human metabolism of the planet. And that is to say it's also food-related activities are collectively the major driver of climate change. I mean, that would be a fair summary. Which means that our models of agriculture are massively important for how we respond to climate change, which means that the ways that we organize how we eat is massively important for how we respond to climate change. You know, in the encyclical, there's this lovely language around the nobility of little actions about how we eat, and you know, maybe there could have been a bit stronger of a punch there about not just saying you can eat more simply. You might just say, yeah, like we should move away from certainly things like industrial feedlots. And, so I think I just want to endorse the intuition behind the question. That's something that we should think carefully about. And I think I would also add, for communities of faith, think about all the spiritual practices that we have around eating and the ways that those spiritual practices open possibilities for meaningfully responding to climate change in the spaces of our everyday life. That might be some of the most meaningful things that we can do.
It's a great question, and I would agree that eating meat, for example, has been linked to, I think, 30 or 40% of the emissions globally. So it has a huge impact. And there's a great TED Talk called The Weekend Vegetarian, which is, I think, a very accommodating and inviting way for people to consider eating a little less meat, but not, you know, never ever again having bacon or whatever it is you love. So it's a great TED Talk to check out, The Weekend Vegetarian. And it also speaks to the problem of waste and how much I think the UN has calculated that 1/3 of all food is wasted. So if we just recover that food, we are saving the emissions that produced it, the labor that went into it, the transport, everything, and addressing the hunger needs as well.
Just on the same question, I think one of the reasons that the impacts, or at least the abuses of the factory farming system goes ignored is that in some states there are laws against bringing cameras into feedlots and slaughterhouses. So it's very easy for us to avert our eyes from the ways in which the animals we consume are actually treated. And now, women. Women are among the most affected by climate change, especially in the global south. Women carry water. They find, I think this says, they find firewood. They grow crops, I think that's what this says, and provide daily food for families. The encyclical does not address this. How can nonprofits like Caritas International, Catholic Relief Services International, women's congregations like nuns help address this issue? The Catholic Church is a global organization. How seriously is it taking the environmental role of women?
Well, I imagine this conversation may have taken place earlier in this conference, and one of the things that I'm most proud of as a Catholic is its international witness and its charitable efforts, and we know that the sisters and all of their partners are doing unbelievable work here and abroad. So by focusing on women, on education for girls and women, on investing in women through microloans and other sorts of small industry, that is the pathway to lift up economies. So everything that can be done is huge. And I would mention specifically for carrying wood, bringing water, deforestation devastates the access to water and makes it even harder for girls to locate it, makes it harder for them to go to school, another reason to double our efforts. But the problem of the health impacts of energy poverty primarily kill women and children, have a huge, I think 290 million deaths in childbirth a year, and the deaths from interior cook stoves. So solar cook stoves and solar lighting are a huge way to reduce the health impacts of these short-lived climate pollutants, which are the major contribution from the developing world, and to also provide renewable energy. And those technologies exist. If we, as church, donated a solar lamp every Advent, every family one solar lamp, that would be great. That would have a huge impact, allow people to do their homework indoors, donate a solar cook stove, eliminate those toxins indoors. It would be a phenomenal movement.
I just want to say that I'm really appreciating the format of the sort of question thesis. It's really great. I mean, I wish the papers were longer, then we would hear more from you. So, look, there's a lot that can be said about this, and I think already a number of people are observing that the encyclical was weak in this area. And among the many things that could be said, let me just observe this. The figure of Mother Earth is not obviously great for women. Do we want to gender the Earth as female? Maybe that makes me think we have the kind of mothers who will clean up after our messes and provide endlessly for us, and always smile at our little faults, right? Like there's a whole ecofeminist critique about the way that exploitation of women and exploitation of environments goes hand in hand, and I think I'll just observe that and let it sit.
I mean, it is interesting because the Pope keeps saying, mostly in press conferences, that the church needs to develop its theology of women. I mean, I think a lot of women theologians might say that, well, we've been kind of working on that for a while.
Right.
Well, and what we need is a theology of the human person that is adequate to the human experience, whether as a woman or a man. And I would echo your insight about what is our views of women. I was at a panel at Union Theological in which was also speaking a member of a Native American tribe from New York, and she said, we need to honor the earth as our mother. Do we do this? Would you harm your mother? But I thought many of us take our mothers for granted, so it's not necessarily an automatic lead into respect.
But why do you think, I mean, it's obvious that poor women and children are harmed first by environmental degradation. How did they not rate much of a mention in this thing? I mean, I find it perplexing, just as a reader. Any speculation on that score?
I don't have an answer.
Yeah, okay.
Patriarchy was the suggestion.
Oh, yes, I heard that, yeah. Well, maybe in the second draft. Our next was Sorry?
What women were in
Oh, I wish I knew. Yes, well, because we all know the Pope wrote it. So our next question. Willis makes the point that the practice of everyday life matters. Aaron highlights how energy decisions are fundamentally ethical decisions. Ascetic language and practices have suffered critique and runs against the norms of modernity. Is this a genre that theological ethics might retrieve?
Sorry, the genre of asceticism, is that the question?
I presume so. Ascetic language and practices have suffered critique and run against the norms of modernity. That must be it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an obvious thread in the encyclical. Certainly, Francis wants to do that. He is explicitly appealing to the form of asceticism in St. Francis as a way of restoring us to wonder at the earth and restoring our sight, our spiritual sight, to see the goodnesses of earth. And that is that's a classic theme in asceticism that in many traditions, even in non-Christian traditions, that asceticism is a form of training in how to see the world and its truths correctly. And I would just say so in general, yes, there seems to be a lot of opportunity there. And let me add this, that was one more point. Where religious traditions have spiritualities, and especially ascetic spiritualities, that can retrain desire and sight, then that also gives them the possibility to offer practices that are meaningful to our hearts and to our deepest senses of experience. Positive experiences. And so, environmentalists in North America have struggled with a kind of thin asceticism, the constant language of sacrifice, reduction, simplicity that doesn't seem to go with any broader account of goods to be realized through those sacrifices, where spiritual communities have ascetic practices that are oriented toward a greater good. They have a whole lot of power that I think environmentalism broadly has suffered from the lack.
I think that's the key point. What are the goods that we are choosing when we undergo or take on ascetic practices? That asceticism is not a language that works in the public square. It doesn't work with the general expression of the American dream. And for that reason, I think it can be very counterproductive if we're trying to pragmatically build coalitions and go forward. But as a spiritual community, to emphasize that when we choose one thing, we are highlighting all the relationships that go with that. That's actually the theme of my book, The Paradox of Creative Sacrifice. That the sacrifices we choose creatively reinforce our own identity. So if I have a loving relationship with the earth, a kinship with all these creatures, what I do to affirm that identity doesn't take away from me. It makes me more of who I am. And in the same way, the sacrifices that I choose as a mother or as a spouse or as a friend don't make me less of who I am. They make me more of a mother or a friend. And of course, I have to honor myself as well. And this is one of my favorite lines from Laudato Si, when the Pope, quoting John Paul II, says, "We are also God's gift to ourselves." We have to honor our own natural limits, and it's because of that finitude that sacrifice and possibly asceticism is needed. We can't do everything. We have to honor our finitude and choose those lifestyles, those choices, those gifts of our time, our energy that are the most precious and that really affirm who we are as creatures and as people in relationship.
Yeah, he has that great line. Especially those of us in affluent nations, he wants us to act more ethically, to view others, as he puts it, quote, no longer as strangers, but as part of the we which all of us are trying to create. On to question 5. One of the many obstructions to our common home are the sanctioned rapid rise of PAC money by our government. What suggestions might be available to reach our common home in dialogue with or against massive amounts of capital? So the question, as I understand it, is that efforts to respond to the climate crisis are being blocked by PAC money. So how can we actually break through the noise that is generated by that kind of shadow financing in order to advance the arguments that Francis wants us to consider?
That is a really thorny problem, because that completely contradicts the value of participation, of transparency, when one person has a vote and a voice that's equal to everyone else, when outsized corporations can purchase that power and promote denial. It's an enormous problem. I think to have more public affirmation of what we care about, and all of what Pope Francis has done with Laudato Si is hugely important for raising public concern about the environment. I think the Climate March was a breakthrough moment in the climate movement, where it demonstrated that there is a sizable proportion of the public that cares, that is concerned, and 410,000 of them were willing to get on the streets of New York. So I think those things start to convey the insistence of the public that there be change, and hopefully begin to crumble, but it's an enormous problem.
It is, and should continue to be shamed. I find myself referring to the political conditions of our society as plutocracy, and I think it's important to just keep saying that we live now in a plutocratic society, and to shame that as not actually the ideals of our democracy, let alone whatever other commitments we may have. And I actually, I take heart from the kind of response to Francis in the past weeks. I mean, that's, I think there's a response to him that includes also, among the many kinds of responses to him, that includes also a sense that he stands for, and his visit stood for, some transparency and some disgust with the capture of politics by finance.
And I think we can also emphasize solutions and actions. There have always been powerful interests controlling government or society forever in one form or another, but there are actions that people can take in their own home, purchasing renewable energy through their utility. They can advocate within their community. They can act within their cities. The network of cities globally is hugely influential. Bloomberg originally, I think, was the head of the Global Cities Initiative, which has done great work. So even if everything doesn't happen on a federal level, there are other levels where things can be done, and we can't use that as an excuse for saying, oh, there's too many PACs. You know, there's a lot we can do.
So this is actually a related question. What theological and pastoral resources can best convert the minds and hearts of those who sustain social sin with uses of fossil fuel investments and presumably a lot of other investments? So what theological and pastoral resources can lead to conversion on this issue?
So the way I would think about that question is, I mean, there's two kinds of sort of, I guess, target audiences, right? There are people who would identify, I suppose, as Christian or perhaps as Catholic, and the question is about what kind of arguments can one marshal to one's fellow members in the faith when one disagrees with them. And I would say, if that's the question, Erin's doing a great job. You should read what she's writing. She's offering pastoral and theological resources for thinking about energy ethics in a Catholic frame. So there. But then there's the broader pluralist question. What role do theological or religious arguments broadly have in transforming the political possibilities of a pluralist political sphere? That's actually much more complicated, but I'll pick up from the language in the question about sin. You know, I mean, one of the things that Patriarch Bartholomew I, the Eastern Orthodox Church, known as the Green Patriarch, in the 90s, he started talking about environmental problems in terms of sin, and it just captured the imagination of so many people most of whom were not Orthodox, but it introduced a new kind of vocabulary for getting at something about the human relationship to Earth that seemed right to them. And so I think that there is also that, in addition to other roles, there is that role for theology in the public sphere, in that it offers imaginative resources for thinking about the human relationship to Earth and to one another, and I think that is among its several roles. That is one role of the encyclical as well.
I would say that centering this response in faith and in worship and in our creedal affirmation of God as creator is central, because it needs to be a a joyful celebration of who we are, not a divisive political conversation, because that is where climate change falls flat and dies in the parish, in the congregation, in interfaith coalitions. It needs to be a celebration of our values, of our traditional beliefs, which are now being resynthesized into a new spirituality that unites our traditional longing to be people of justice with the fact that to be a person of justice today requires acting in new ways. So that transformation has to take place through conversations such as this, through parish discussions of the encyclical. And then I think an invitation to people, in addition to the fascinating revelation that the sin language brings, because that just shifts one's frame in startling and effective ways, but to also say, who are you as a person of faith? What do you want to affirm? What do you want to leave for your children, and how do you live out your sense as a believer? I think that's very important, to build on one's positive conceptions of oneself in their faith.
Mm-hmm. So I think we have time for one more question. Much criticism of the encyclical focuses on the Pope's undifferentiated and unrealistic critique of capitalism as such. Could you say, one, whether the critique is justified, and two, how essential is it to ecological ethics?
Yeah, great question. It's a great question because it gets at how do we interpret the world in which we live. And Francis clearly brings a kind of a skepticism to capitalism that is, I would say, maybe more striking, but it's not a total departure from the long tradition of Catholic social thought. I mean, I feel like every time, and this maybe you would know better than Grant, but my sense is that every time a pope says something that is a little bit skeptical of Catholicism, in just the middle way that Catholic social thought has always been, from rerum novarum, the Western press kind of flips out.
You mean skeptical of capitalism?
Yeah, skeptical of capitalism.
I think he's all on board with Catholicism.
Oh, is that what I said?
Yeah.
You did.
That's funny.
That's right.
Yeah, that would make the press flip out.
That would be amazing. Yeah, that would be huge.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that anyway, so there's a perception that this is a totally new socialist teaching. I don't think that's true, but I do think it's true that he brings more frustration and skepticism, especially about the turn that global capitalism has taken in the past couple of decades with the emergence of finance-driven capitalism and the sort of obviously empty promises for the world's poor. He's shown just a new kind of impatience with that, which I think is utterly salutary. Now, when it comes down to like very practical things about like whether and how to get a price on carbon, I guess I would say I'm just more pragmatic about it. I think that getting a price on carbon is the best and most pervasive form of coercion available to us. We've got to try and figure out how to do it. That doesn't mean that it has to be just how William Nordhaus wants to do it, I guess I in general like appreciate the tone which I think many of us in the global north need to hear. And I wish that there would be maybe a more pragmatic engagement about how precisely to twist capitalism and to twist market devices towards socially beneficial outcomes.
I would agree that it's convenient to frame the Pope's discussion as a rejection of capitalism when in fact it's a highly nuanced critique of neoliberal capitalism, of laissez-faire capitalism, of unbridled capitalism, of all these things.
Right, it's always qualified in the encyclical.
It's always qualified, and again, as you've said, the Catholic social teaching tradition has always had this nuanced assessment of capitalism, and his concern is that market forces themselves cannot create social inclusion and environmental protection, and those are the goals that need to be brought in with other means. I think that he's savvy enough to avoid making detailed policy prescriptions. I'm grateful he left the carbon price alone, maybe because then he couldn't be attacked for recommending a carbon tax, right? Because nothing would be more destructive than for the Pope to recommend a carbon tax.
Taxes,
right, then we definitely have, a Marxist or something. But I agree that a carbon price is a way to go, and hopefully because the Pope did not reject the carbon price, we can still move ahead with it.
Cool.
Okay, all right. So our time is almost at an end, and I'd like to thank our two panelists and our moderator who did a great job of fielding questions and even making up some questions. So thank you, and thank you to both Aaron and Willis.